stronger than the opinion of the...
Okay, all right, well, thank you everybody for being here today. This is very exciting for us to get to host these gentlemen to talk about Gerald Ford's visit from 50 years ago. We're here on September 11th at the 50th anniversary of Ford's visit to Amherst, New Hampshire. And without further ado, I'll turn it over to Bill Gardner, former Secretary of State of New Hampshire.
Thanks, Matt. Welcome, everyone. It's an honor for me to introduce my speaker. I was in the House with Representative G. Winthrop Brown. That's what he went. He didn't put George. He put G. Winthrop Brown. And George Roberts, who was the Speaker then. It's rare to have someone as Speaker of the House and 50 years later, because speakers are usually in their 50s or 60s. They're like town moderators. They have to be able to sort of command authority and respect, and that's the type of position it is. And what's really unusual is we have today Bill Viette, who lives in the house that Franklin Pierce, who was our 14th president, was married in that living room. Well, Franklin Pierce is the youngest by far of any Speaker of the House. He was Speaker when he was 26 years old. There's been no one in the 20s. And you rarely get someone in the 30s, except we have George Roberts here today, who was in his 30s when he became Speaker. So it's a unique connection that this House and the House just up the road a ways. So with that, we have 3 or 4 people who are connected to all this. And the event was very unusual in American history. We'll probably never see anything like it again, where a president can show up in the state at 9 in the morning and then cross the whole state from near the Vermont border to the Atlantic Ocean and give speeches along the way. And we're lucky that a 23-year-old at that time who had a connection to President Ford through the governor, and he's here today, and he's going to be able to also speak about what it was like, all the different stops that were made. So think about having a president come and speak 23 different times and then stop at intersections when people were waving, but even more so to be in a house that had a sitting president that actually had a meal here. That is really rare. And at the event, when it happened in Exeter, people were talking about how George Washington had visited Exeter, but they've never had a sitting president since Washington. So I don't know if Amherst ever had a sitting president. That's some research that someone can do. So with that, it's the honor to have Speaker Roberts, who decided what seat Representative Brown was going to sit in, who decided what committee he was going to serve on. And obviously, I knew him. I said very few words to him. He was an older gentleman. I was in my 20s. But Speaker Roberts had a lot more to do with him, and it's such an honor to have him with us, and he's going to sort of be the master this morning. So with that, George, it's yours.
Well, thank you, Bill. And thank everybody for coming here, and particularly the owners of this house. It's really a historic house. The architecture aside, what happened here, it's a long way around to the story, but what happened here was probably one of the more significant things that happened in the campaign of Jerry Ford, in the presidential campaign. But just to go back to a couple of things. First of all, I used to call George Brown, I used to call him Colonel, and I don't know why, because I found out he was in the Navy. But I liked him. He was a tall, straight back gentleman, fastidious in his dress, and very careful what he said. And it wasn't a lot, but it was meaningful. He was liked by his members, and of course he was Amherst, and someone who apparently just came to New Hampshire at some point, or his family did, and happened to be in Amherst, and happened to be a person that, in his retirement years, if you will, wanted to be a participant in politics. I knew Gerald Ford from a couple of different perspectives. One particularly when I was in the legislature. I was going to Washington, testifying before different committees, seeing congressmen like Congressman Bass, who's with us today. Later on, even trying to lobby them. But I would see Jerry Ford quite often. He was an activist in the background. He was a leader, a very quiet leader, very well-respected person. And as the circumstances happened, I watched him all of a sudden become the vice president, which was, I thought, a great thing to be happening at a time when there was turmoil going on in this country. And then immediately, almost immediately, becoming president, which was just going to be unbelievably historically. And I saw this man who was strong and a quiet person, really, very well respected, moving up the ranks, which I thought would be the epitome of the American political scene. So I got to see the president several times in the White House. And Jerry Ford is a square. I mean, some people know exactly what I mean by that. He would not do anything that he thought was improper. So we would meet and go down into one of the basements of the White House. What floor it was, I can't remember if it's a submarine or sub basement or not. But there's a hangout he would have that was total privacy. And he would kick off those lace loafers that had like golf shoes, almost, with the little tabs on them. Put his feet up on the credenza or the table and just relax. And actually, we had a cigar one time. And I went to talk to him about his presidential ambitions. He said, I can't talk about that. I'm in the White House. It's against the law for me to talk about any political scheduling or organization, period. Even campaign fundraising. And I had to stop and think. I said, well, would you come and visit the New Hampshire legislature? And he said, I think if you talk to our schedule, perhaps that could be arranged. So he did. He came to New Hampshire earlier. And when he did, it was pretty much a foregone conclusion that President Ford would not only be the nominee, but he would be the president. The opposition didn't really have a strong position. He had inherited it, which was a little bit of a lump, that he inherited the job, or he was appointed for the job, but they couldn't find much wrong with Jerry Ford in his background, because there wasn't anything that was wrong. And when he decided to come, his managers said, we are not going to do this in a very clownish way. We're not going to have an awful lot of clownish attitudes or phrases. He's going to come to the legislature and he's going to talk about policy. Fine, he's the president. So it was really staged, and I mean that in the best way. Concord was secured 2 to 3 weeks before. An office building I later occupied had at least 8 people on the roof, and all the roof areas in the plaza were full of men with appropriate ammunition and guns. They had checked a lot of people. We had a little problem with some legislators who insisted on the right to bear arms and walk into the House of Representatives, which was a rule that was authorized by the legislature itself. But rather than give away their piece, they decided not to attend that day. But it was like a drama. They drove up with the limousines. They stopped in front of the Memorial Arch, which was an arch of the Civil War. On the top is a Gatling gun that was used in the Mexican War. He walked under that arch with an entourage. There were 10,000 people estimated anyway in that square, the buildings around it. He came up the sidewalk, and Governor Thompson, who was not too well supportive of Ford, insisted to be there because he was, of course, the head of state on the executive branch. And Al Jacobson and myself greeted him as legislative leaders. And he stopped, he made short remarks, a very affable guy. He had tremendous applause and attention. And I particularly noticed on that day, because I knew all the legislators' persuasions and philosophies, there was not any grimacing or any booing. It was really quite amazing. So we brought him into the State House, in the so-called holding room, they'd call it. It was a Kennedy room, a small one. And he sat down and I gave him a copy of Manchester Union Leader. And on the front page, there was this big photograph. And the photograph of Gerald Ford with his arm around this beautiful woman. He's got a big sweater on. And underneath it was a caption. On the top it was a caption that said, "Did Jerry tell Betty about this woman?"
Oh, jeez.
So that was the nature of some of the political attitude, at least by one newspaper. And he looked at it and he said, "Where'd you get this made up?" And I said, "It's not made up, Jerry. It's a statewide newspaper." He said, "What a bunch of jerks." And that's about the toughest thing I ever heard him say about people, in any describing people. I'm sure there were days, but you never heard him in a public discourse use mean language or hated language, and that's very meaningful as we reflect upon just the last few days. And now also on 9/11, unfortunately today. But he came to this up on the floor, and he insisted that he not speak from the rostrum. He said, "I want to be on the floor with the members," even though it's an elevated floor. He stood on that floor, and the amazing thing to me was that the casualness of him. He's a strong man, he played football. And he stood there with one foot tucked behind the heel. And he changed it every once in a while. And he spoke very calmly and softly about the federal government in the state of New Hampshire and what was a huge issue then. It was the mandated funds that the state had to do things or they would lose money. He then went to Concord Highway Hotel where the Chamber of Commerce had a big reception. And it was huge, and it was packed. And again, there were all sorts of people from the business community there. And they were all, if not supportive, they were at least all very polite. He was the type of guy that drew that from people. And that was one of the great things about it. But to that day, Bill, sorry to get off on these tangents, but he finally decided to come, and his handlers was somewhat equivocal about it. Reagan was out there running, not declared, I don't believe, at that time.
That's right.
But Ford was declared. So he flew in the King, where I met him with Marshall French, my majority leader. And the purpose for his visit was not just for him. It was that Louis Wyman was running for the United States Senate. And Louis Wyman had been somewhat controversial with the liberal Republicans and very controversial with the Democrats for some of his positions as Attorney General, but people looked at it as sort of his time because he had been such a long-term congressperson. So it was for his purpose. So we get into the cars and we drive along, and the crowds were amazing. School kids were let out, kids were there waving flags. There were a few signs, you know, "Go Jerry" and there didn't seem to be anything negative. There were some negatives toward Wyman, as there always was. But for the most part, the focus was on Jerry Ford, and Wyman felt a little bit peeved that that's what the focus is. And at one point in the tour, he said to me, he said, I won't get one damn vote out of this. Which I think was wrong, because I told him, go and hug some more women and shake some babies' hands, and what do you need to do? Because he was holding back, probably in deference to the president. So finally we get to Amherst, and the place is crowded. There are all sorts of dignitaries here. Governor Thompson was here. Senator Cotton was here. Two former presidents of Senates, and Al Jacobson was here along with me, and also Marshall French. And everybody in the Republican Party who was in the hierarchy and the local politicians, and I use that word as it is, they're political people who wanted to see the President of the United States and the person who probably they were going to elect. And it was a great social function. The place was crowded. That room was packed. I think the food was set up in that room. So you better remember. So Jerry Ford's in there, and he's going around, and there's security, but not quite as dense as it is today. But he's walking around, and of course, Mr. Brown is introducing everybody personally. Hope you remember his name, you know. And everybody wants the president to remember that they spoke to him at some point. And Jerry Ford is a very sincere guy, and he's sort of listening to some of the bits and pieces of conversation that they're putting in his way. And then along comes former governor, the first governor, Greg, who I had known, and I campaigned for him when I was a 12-year-old kid, along with my uncle. And there was a friend of my uncle's, and he came in sort of like on a side wing. I think he came in the side door, is that right? And he was looking for Ford, and he wanted to see him. And then I was standing near Ford, and one of the security said, the governor wants to speak to you. And so I said to Representative Brown, is there a place there's some privacy? He said, yes, upstairs. And they shook their head. And then he said, well, you can go in the kitchen. And they shook their head. And he said, well, there's a woodshed behind the kitchen, which was really part of the building, I believe.
Yeah.
At the same time.
It's a garage.
So that's where they went. And I went kind of trailing after them, because I was by his side almost all the time. And there was some conversation, you couldn't hear the words, and finally I heard some heated words. And then the door came open, and out came Governor Gregg. And I think he left quite rapidly from that door. And I didn't see him again. And later on I got in the car with Ford, because most people don't realize it, but I think you would understand it. He had a second. He had a bald-headed guy that looked a lot like Jerry Ford that sat in the back of the limousine with a machine gun on his lap. And people were waving to him thinking it was Ford. Ford had a lot more hair, but I got to ride with Jerry Ford, and I said, "Hey, what happened in there?" He said, well, he pushed me to the wall, words to that effect. And I said, what do you want? He said, he wanted me to name him chairman of his campaign. And I said, it sounds like you probably said no. He said, I'm not ready to make that decision. Well, in reality, I think it was that Greg thought that Ford needed to have some New Hampshire flavor to his campaign. And Greg probably thought, having been a campaigner, and he had been a good one, even though he lost for election after the first term, there was some absence between the first and the second try, that he could pull him over the top. because everybody was doing polling, and they knew that Reagan had a great amount of support, or at least popular support. Whether it could be turned into votes was still in question. And Greg probably felt, well, I could pull him over the top, and left, I guess you would use the word, in a huff. But he wasn't ready to make that decision or to be pushed in that decision. And then fast forward, Ford wins the primary. The Reagan group, which primarily was spearheaded by Thompson and Senator Money, President of the Senate, and Jerry Carmen, who later became the GOP chairman, very, very upset. Reagan went to the convention, and after a lot of cajoling and applause and pushing and shoving politically, Reagan came to the stage, waved his hand and held his hand up and tried to show an era of a time of reconciliation and getting back together, like we all used to believe that's what you did in politics. As it turned out, in reality, Reagan primarily campaigned for congressional candidates, gave a good word here and there for Ford, but his team would not accept Ford. And they were telling him, stay back, don't do anything, this guy will probably lose, and you'll have your place in the sun. And as it turned out, that's what happened. So all of that dialogue, unfortunately, I think a lot of it happened right here. And I thought forever and ever. We know that Ford won the primary in New Hampshire by 1.5% perhaps, Shelley. So very close. We know nationally he was very popular, except the Nixon pardon really threw the wrench in the works. But even with that, it was going to actually still be a close race. And maybe if Greg had been the chairperson, maybe Greg would impose some of his style, the New Hampshire way, upon the campaign, and the campaign would have been able to, and Greg would have been able to isolate Reagan from a full-blown primary to save face, or at least after the primary, get them to reconsider their attitude quicker than they did. Just maybe. Who knows? But that's my point of view. So this is a very important little place you have here.
Yeah.
Because when you wind it all the way down in politics, on public life, and Charlie will tell you, and you'll tell somebody too, and Bill will tell, that it's the little things that really make the difference. It's the personal attitudes and the way you say things. I always said I love the French language because you could say some of the worst things and it sounded so beautiful. But in the English language, the worst things really sound bad. So this is an important little point in history. I hope people recognize that in the future in American politics is that everything you do is so reflective on whether other people are going to accept your point of view, even they originally disagree with you. If you have a certain way about you, you probably can gather political support. I think Ford gathered that support, but that one little thing probably hurt him, probably more than anything else, other than the Nixon part in the job. David, you were here too. You were outside the door. This is David Oman, rather, from Iowa. And he's interested in New Hampshire because they claim they have the first caucus.
Yeah.
And now they want to have the first primary. Go ahead.
Well, thank you, George. Good morning.
Good morning.
First of all, thank you to the Brown, extended Brown and Larson families for having us here today. It's a special day, certainly for me, who was here 50 years ago to this day, on a day just like this. And, you know, for the last couple of weeks, knowing this was coming, I thought so many times, how many times in life do you look back and think of where you were exactly 50 years ago on any particular day? It's pretty rare. So to be back here is a joy for me. And I want to share a little bit about Bill, because Bill has become a very dear friend of mine in the last couple of years. And I wouldn't be here today if it weren't for you. Very quickly, I was on the press secretary to the governor of Iowa. Robert Ray, who was a terrific guy, was elected 5 times, and was very close to President Ford, and chaired the platform committee in Kansas City, and was on the short list to be vice president. That's another conversation for another day, Bob Dole. But Ford had been at the Iowa State Fair in August of '75. And that's sort of a de rigueur place to go, whether you're running in the caucuses or getting set to run in the general. 100,000 people on the grounds on any given day. And Ford was a new president, and Ray liked him, and the White House team asked if the Ray staff, some of us could help the Ford staff put that event together on relatively short notice. And so I got to know some of those guys. And then the event on 9/11/75 was on a Thursday. 9/11/25, we're right back on a Thursday. So I can go quickly on this, but the Ford people called me on a Monday and said, can you fly to Boston and come up to New Hampshire tomorrow and help us with the press? And I said, well, let me talk to the governor, you know, and he's the boss. And he said, well, do you want to go? And I said, yes. Well, then go. So I flew up here. I think it was the first time I rented a car. I got a car at Logan, and up here we came. And very quickly, the advance team had been around and laid out this trip, as already has been discussed, 12 hours, 22 to 23 stops in about 15 towns, and Bill has taught me the difference between a city and a town in New Hampshire, and some rural intersections. And when the event was the day was all done, police sources, security sources, media sources reported that about 108,000 people saw the president on that one glorious September 11 day. That was, I looked it up, that's about 1/8 of the population of your state. So it undoubtedly helped him in the primary, and probably to an extent in the general. It didn't help Louis Wyman in the special. And Ford was here to help Wyman. He was here on September 11, and then I've done a 2,500 word piece that I'll get to all of you. It's online this week. You know, the irony of 9/11, that's the 9/11 we all think about, and we still mourn. But the stop at this home and across the southern tier of your state was on a different 9/11, aimed at helping Wyman, who was running in that special on September 16, after a Senate race that never got decided a year after the election. And Bill has done some remarkably good writing about that whole saga. Never happened before in the history of the United States. God willing, will never happen again in the history of the United States. So, building on what the advance team had done a couple of days prior, Eric Rosenberger, who was the press guy, and me, went through the whole route, made many of the stops, not all the stops, because we made a decision that Ford's motorcade was going to move so quickly, and that we couldn't get the press out. If we got the press out of the buses too, and move them and back, you couldn't do it. So there's a press pool that gets put together wherever the president goes, select videographer, a couple print people, and a radio person. They'll jump out, they'll cover it, so God forbid something happens. When we saw heard about a shooting yesterday, not a political official, that there's always some media coverage around the president, something, that whether it's good or bad, there's always some video of him. But so all the press did not come out on that day. Dean suggested I talk about maybe some of the highlights. I'm not going to go through. We'll get you the text of the feature story, but I would think there were. I believe there were 3 or 4 that day. I'll just talk about for a minute. Ford landed at the Keene Airport and came down the steps. Now, mind you, this stop in your state happened 1 week after Sarah Jane Moore pulled a gun out when Ford was walking on the grounds of the California Capitol in Sacramento. And Secret Service agent Boondorf grabbed, put his hand in the gun and jammed the gun. And Ford walked into the Capitol, met Jerry Brown, never even told him what happened on the front lawn of the Capitol until Brown heard about it later. So that happened a week before. A week after that, Squeaky Fromm got a shot off at Ford when he was back in California, getting into his limo in San Francisco. So security was tight that day here. And Ford stepped off of Air Force One, and I likened this in my essay. If you remember baseball, some of us who are old enough remember baseball home plate umpires that had a big stiff chest protector. And Ford got off the plane, and he was wearing a bulletproof vest, and he was going around. You were there, George. How are you? How are you? And the press went bananas. The president's wearing a bulletproof vest, and so it rippled back to some of us on the bus, and I didn't write this because out of respect to having been a staff person, you respect people who do that kind of work. But the White House, Nesson was not on the trip. Ron Nesson just died earlier this year. He was press secretary. The deputy was a guy named Bill Greener, good guy. He was the press person on the trip. They asked him about it, and what did he do? He denied that the president was wearing a bulletproof vest. And the press were, like, Bill, we can see it. And my first draft, I wrote down that the Ford White House didn't learn all of the lessons of Watergate, which are led by tell the truth, just own it and tell the truth. And I'll flip ahead. So when Ford came into this home, it was the first time he took his suit coat off. He was going to relax and have a picnic lunch with lemonade, and he showed everybody that he had this half-inch thick bulletproof vest under his shirt. And by about the same time at noon, Greener acknowledged to everybody, okay, the president's wearing his bulletproof vest. So that's the story. The story was out. So the Keene stop, we were there a year ago. We drove the route a year ago, Bill and I, and Doug from Iowa who helped me. And the Keene stop was spectacular, about 10,000 people. The estimates vary. The high estimate was 10K in the Keene Town Square. I'm not going to talk about everything, but along the way, Ford was given a copy of the Farmer's Almanac for his year of birth, 1913, and for 76. It had been printed, and Ford promised that he would read it all. Really, but in Peterborough, he stopped to do a radio interview. And is this a gentleman my age who was coming up this morning from Massachusetts, where he lives, and his car broke down. So otherwise, David Gablaskis would be here right now to tell the story. But he's not here. So we stopped at a radio station in Peterborough, which is in the basement of a hair salon in the town square. And we walked into the general manager and said, we're with White House, and the president's going to be here in 72 hours or 48 hours, and if you would be so kind, you can do an interview with him. And the guy thought we were a joke, you know. So Eric showed him his credential. I said, we're real, this is a real offer. You can have the President of the United States on the curb for 5 minutes in 2 days. And, okay, we'll do the interview. So David was the young radio guy. He went on to a nice TV and radio career in New England. And so I didn't meet him then because he wasn't at the station when we stopped there. And we didn't offload all of the press to watch Ford do another interview. You know, that just, it wasn't going to work. So David Goblaskis got the only exclusive interview, the only interview Ford did the whole day. And the transcript is available. It's at the Ford Library, as is the Ford schedule, which is printed and is out there on the dining room table. And you look at it, it's fascinating. So Goblaskis asked him a couple of questions about the Middle East and heating oil in New Hampshire, and that was it. Down the road Ford went. Other stops, and we got here. And by that time, he was running about an hour behind schedule because of this tumult. All the people were just surrounding him, and you know, all politics is personal. I mean, you pay great attention to issues in the state policy. Charlie, you were in Congress, but at the end of the day, politics is personal. And you know, I got to know, if I know George Roberts and I shake his hand and listen to him and I know he's a real guy, I'm probably going to vote for him. And Ford was absolutely that way. And so they, you know, throwing caution to the wind, they had him out every place, work, you know, shaking hands, kissing babies. And I write in my essay some of the wonderful quotes that were reported in newspapers around the state the next day, kind things that people said about Jerry Ford, because following Nixon, it wasn't that hard to be a real guy and earn people's trust and affection, and Ford did. So back to Amherst. When we were here a year ago and met you, Matt, and some of your family, George was along, came down and shared the story about what had happened behind the scenes. And I just found that fascinating, read all I could about it, and there's not much. Jules Woodcover's book on the 76 campaign, the best book on that campaign, talked a little bit about it. There are little stories. Hugh Gregg was a good man and wanted to help Ford. And Reagan absolutely was running. He had spoken in Manchester the night before. And Hugh Gregg came and offered to help Ford chair his campaign and run his campaign. And with Ford, his chief of staff was Don Rumsfeld, who I met a couple times later after he left the White House and he ended up working with Bush 43. Tough guy. He was 34-year-old chief of staff, tough guy. And Cheney was underneath him. Rumsfeld and Cheney were Ford's guys. And they were going to run the campaign, and they were going to call the shots in New Hampshire. We were just doing a test caucus in Iowa. Back then, Iowa was not a serious player in the caucus primary system at that time. They wanted to make sure Ford won New Hampshire, and they weren't sure that anybody, and they made a big mistake. I mean, Hugh Gregg was a stalwart guy, but they put him off. Ford nodded and said, "I think that'd be great," and Rumsfeld interrupted and said, "We'll call you back." and Gregg waited 2 weeks. Reagan and his people kept pummeling him with overtures. He called back to the White House. They put him in touch with somebody else. The word finally came back to Gregg: Ford would like you on his team, but doesn't want you to chair the campaign. And Gregg said, "Well, the hell with that," you know. And he called Reagan up, and the rest is history. I think had that happened, as you indicated, I think Ford might have won a little bigger margin. Thompson already was with Reagan. If Gregg had been with Ford, and he won here by a point, just a very, very slight margin. Could you have knocked Reagan out of the race? You don't know. But history would have been different if you had. So from here, by the time, because the woodshed conversation happened after the lunch, he went down the street a couple blocks, huge rally in the town square, very colorful. I'm sure you got I know you got some photographs on the table of all that. That was a quintessential all-American red, white, and blue banners event in this town. And then by that time, he's 2 hours behind schedule. So the Secret Service, they were moving him, the advanced guys are moving him, and there were several stops planned along the way, which were done very quickly. He went, this is now 4 o'clock in the afternoon. And I think part of this was because the team didn't have enough time to lay on serious events everywhere, but they still wanted to stop in as many towns as they could and meet people. So the easy thing to do is to go to a school. So they kept the kids in the school at 4 o'clock, 5 o'clock. And I wrote in my piece that, the kids couldn't vote, but their parents did, so parents were around, and he just burst into those schools, took some pictures, and on down the road he went. The last stop of the day, and I'd say along with Keene and here, one of my favorites was Portsmouth. Beautiful town, great atmosphere. It's dusk. Some of the men had they had lit torches. In the 19th century, you had torchlight parades up in New England. We never heard of that in Iowa, but they had torches, big crowd. Splain was there, and has talked about it with him. And Ford had, by that time, had his cadence down. He knew what he wanted to say. He knew the applause lines that worked. He knew what would stir a crowd, and he gave it his all. I mean, it was the last speech of the day, and he talked about the country recovering from Vietnam, which had happened just that year. We finally said we're done in Vietnam in March of 1975. It was a terrible ending to a long conflict, but Ford helped us get it done, and move on. And I know a year prior to that, there had been Watergate, and the fallout from that, you can discuss plus minus on the pardon, but Ford did it, and he's written about it. I have his book. You can read a number of books, but he felt that they just had to put that in the rearview mirror too, and not relitigate Watergate. He's trying to start a new administration and get the country going, get the economy going, and that was very challenged back then. I still have one of the whip inflation now win buttons that Ford had. You remember, some older people remember those. So Ford put all that in his final remarks in Portsmouth, just left it all out there, and got back to the Portsmouth Air Force. The air base was in Keene. Got to the Portsmouth airport and took off about 9 p.m. So we'd been on the ground in the state 12 hours.
He was elated.
What?
He was elated getting on. I was there getting on.
Well, and I wrote, I'm not really knowing all that, but I wrote, Ford had reason to feel good about the day, because he, again, 100,000 people got to see him. And I think, and I end the piece talking about Ford at the Kansas City Convention. Reagan came up and did what he could, but he didn't do enough. But you nailed it. Reagan talked about the future. Politics is always about the future. And I think Reagan left the dais thinking, I've done the best I can to set up a rerun in 79 and 80, which is exactly what happened. Ford and he had met, this is not in the piece and it's not relevant to this, but I think it's interesting, having done the research. The one thing Reagan did not want to have happen to Kansas City was what? He did not want Ford to ask him to be vice president. He did not want to be on the ticket. He didn't want to be with this person who would run against him and beaten him. And he was thinking a little bit, we'll turn the page, we'll start anew with a conservative message. And so the advance teams met in Kansas City and said it was understood they would meet, that whoever won the nomination would go to the suite of the man who lost. So Ford won the nomination by 100 votes out of 2,500 on the floor and went to Reagan's suite, but precondition was he could not offer him the vice presidency.
By the way, I was in that suite with some of these Trump guns, as they call them,
Yeah,
where they were suggesting that Reagan come there, and then Reagan's group said, no, they're not coming.
Yeah.
And then they came back, well, we want to speak, and then Reagan's people said, well, if he wants to talk to Reagan, his people, he has to come here.
yeah,
And,
back and forth, yeah.
Two of the people with me just couldn't believe that Ford would do that, but Ford understood that that'll make one last chance, because he told me personally, he would not run after he had a full term.
Right,
Because he had 2 years getting into the vice president's presidency, and then 4 years would be enough to set the trend. And that he didn't dislike Reagan as a person. Although what happens, and you see this in the media now because of the way our media works, is that many times the people around the politician set the course, and then they put it in cement, and the politician then can't move. So when they said, all right, he'll come over, Ford was willing to go over, but the Reagan people didn't believe it was not coming, but he did.
they would have preferred that they never talk again.
But the irony that if Reagan had said, okay, what's the deal? Ford would have said, I don't want to be a lame duck, but I can tell you, you'll be the next president. In other words, he'll have to sort of glibly say, I'm not going to take any more than 4 years. It'll be your turn because you would help me get there. He knew Reagan had strength, in the certain sectors of the nation, and just certainly didn't want to throw it away. And so making that move to go and visit Reagan, he hoped would smooth things over. But with Reagan's people behind, like Jerry Carmen and some of the other ones that people had other names for them, they're not radicals, but they said, well, we didn't win this one, we're gonna stay away and let it fall. We'll be back again for another day.
Yeah. Reagan didn't really want to do it, and the one person who really didn't want him to do it was Nancy Reagan. Maybe you're not going to do that. A PS on all that, I was at the Detroit convention in '80, and many of us in Iowa, that was our first serious, real caucus, worked hard for H.W. Bush. And he did really well there and stung Reagan in Iowa. And ultimately, Reagan won the nomination in '80. And right on the night that he won the nomination, and the night before, it was known he was going to be the nominee. Reagan had still not settled on who he wanted on his ticket. And for about 12 hours on the afternoon into the evening and the early morning hours of Wednesday at the convention, Reagan toyed with the idea, you'll remember this, of asking President Ford to come back into public life and be on his ticket. And they actually met in secret, and this has been written about, not a lot. And Ford proffered the idea that maybe they could have what was called a co-presidency. That wasn't going to fly with the Reagan people either. Reagan said, he's worked all that time to become the nominee to get to the president. He wasn't going to have a co-presidency. So they agreed not to do it, and that's when Ford picked H.W. Bush. So we've talked maybe way too long. If anybody has to leave, go. Or if you've got questions, we'd be happy to answer them.
Well, this
Or share some thoughts.
Charlie, you were active.
I actually stand. Stand next to Bill, just for a second, because I'm embarrassed to say I still work, and I have a call at noon, so I have to be back in Peterborough, but it's a pleasure to be here. This event is pre-me. I graduated from Dartmouth College in 1974. In the winter of 1974, I was taking a government class that was being taught by a professor by the name of Larry Radway. And Larry Radway invited a guest to come and speak to our class. He was the just former governor of Georgia, Jimmy Carter. And there were about 25 half drunk or hungover Dartmouth student sitting in his class. Jimmy Carter did a wonderful job talking, and then afterwards, Larry Radway invited anybody in the class who wished to have lunch with he and Governor Carter in Thayer Hall. Nobody went except for me. Now, during the lunch, people came around, but Jimmy Carter was a sort of diminutive fellow, but very personable and nice. It was a wonderful experience for me. Fast forward to this date, 50 years ago, I was working for David Emory in Maine. I had just become his legislative assistant. I had begged, borrowed, steal, kicked, and punched my way to get a position in his office as a Republican in 1975, which after the debacle in 1974. And a year and 2 months later, I went to the convention in Kansas City. And the week after that, Dave Emory made me his chief of staff at age 24. And I watched Reagan's speech, and it was truly a speech that changed the whole political environment for Jerry Ford. My father served with Jerry Ford in Congress. They knew each other quite well. When Ford came to Peterborough, I believe, I wasn't there, that they had a short meeting or they saw each other or something happened. And my father commended Ford for doing this kind of campaigning because he pointed out that New Hampshire is a state that's very touchy-feely, and if you're perceived as being interested in individuals, focusing on one person or another, you're going to have it's going to reverberate. And he told the story to Ford or Taft, a U.S. Senator running against Dwight D. Eisenhower. My father was an Eisenhower guy. He came to Peterborough much the same way Ford did, and a little boy offered him a gallon, or a quart rather, of New Hampshire maple syrup. And he turned and looked the other way and shook somebody else's hand. It was well covered in the Peterborough transcript, and it sort of became a moniker of what Taft's issues were. And Eisenhower, I believe, clocked him in New Hampshire in 1952. Eisenhower was much more personable. It is an interesting day today for many different reasons, but this is obviously a great opportunity to commemorate a very important day in the history of Republican politics and the New Hampshire primary. And I just want to thank our former Secretary of State and former Speaker for having made this whole thing possible. Thanks.
Don't be embarrassed about being a working man, I am too.
But your legislature's not in session. The Congress is.
Yeah. There's one little tidbit, there are lots of them. In Portsmouth, there happened to be, other than the torches, balloons all over the place.
Yeah.
And I was with someone, they didn't like God, and so there's probably some other words, he put them there. As the balloons went up, they started to burst.
Scared
Jerry Ford, go right over. They didn't let them fall over, they just coached right down, and then they quickly decided to.
George, I got to tell a quick little story also. So I was in Congress working, Judd Gregg and I were Dole people. Dole was about to lose in New Hampshire, I believe to Pat Buchanan, I can't. But we had a huge rally in Milford, and Dole had a very, very good sense of humor, as everybody knows. And around the corner comes this huge group of people running and cheering and carrying torches. And Dole looks at me and he says, "What the hell is this? The Ku Klux Klan?" Jerry Ford did not help Louis Wyman in this particular day. Wyman was finished already because of his behavior after the general election. It was not going to happen. And probably because of the Nixon pardon and other things, it probably wasn't a net positive.
Philosophical with it.
Thanks, Charlie.
Sorry.
Thank you, Connie. 50 years ago, and the reason I got into politics, because I got upset about the state representative actually liked me the way he voted, but my family had always been political in the sense of being participants. And I'm concerned about, in the course of events, that we not only get divided, we get into parallel lanes. And the great thing about the Hampshire primary, of course, they traditionally have been in the past a way to reach a lot of people. I remember Jim McCarthy too came to my office and he said he was running for president, and we gave every candidate the courtesy to go down to the floor in a joint convention and bring in the senators. We would let each candidate speak for 5 minutes. And McCarthy came to my office because I had been a gentleman in Washington on the Council on Aging in the White House during the Nixon administration. And I met a gentleman, his name, I forget him, this U.E. Gaston III. I was asked to come here by a fellow named Jimmy Carter. And I said, oh yeah, he said, he's going to be president someday. And I said, oh yeah? He said, yeah. And he said, a manual. I said, a manual? What's a manual? He said, it's a manual. I said, and he finally said, it's a book. But it's written in reverse. The first page is his inauguration speech. And you flip it and you go back. So you go back to the last page where he does a sit down in a supporter's household. And he gets 4 people there. And he describes that meeting and he says, we have to have more of these. And that's how he started. And he had this manual to get him there. My point being, you never know when you're talking in politics what's going to develop. So the key thing in politics is be nice to people on the way, because on the way down it gets pretty raw if you're not. I was nice to him. So Carter comes to the house, and so I said to Mr. Carter, I said, well, we have a rule. I said, 5-minute rule. You can speak about yourself, a little biography, and why you want to be president, but don't get too deep in the politics. And that's when the 5 minutes are going by. I said, well, finally I yanked the back of his coat. And he said, oh, he said, he's pulling my coat. He must have been on vaudeville. Bad ass. They pulled you upstage. But Jimmy Carter became a friend of New Hampshire to a lot of people because he stayed in people's houses. He stayed overnight. He even stole one of the senator's suits. He put it on because he ripped his pants and he had to go to a meeting, and so he sent it down on the coast, Democratic senator from Hampton, lent him his suit. So we're back in the White House 2 years later, and he's there and they have all these presentations. Then they finally says, anybody have any questions? And the state senator said, yeah, when are you gonna give me my suit back? So it was I guess it was a kind of thing. It was dramatic for us, the things that were happening, because everything was important. But it was a kind of way of doing things. And in light of a lot of other things that happened, I'm concerned that the outside football stadium approach, the big rallies where people have fun and march and have signs and even torch-lit parades, that might go by the board, and that'd be a terrible loss. So I think we have to speak out and say that we're not going to stop talking. We just have to talk a different way. Don't mean to be philosophical, but I think the people of the past that we know, and Bill knew lots of them, and you know lots of them, and people who were more than 35, they were kind of people. They were tough, talking in private, cussing maybe, but in public, they gained points like Kennedy, using poetry to get a point across, or Bob Dole using humor to soften the blow of the dramatic thing he's saying.
Again, Bill, I want to thank you for being the glue of all of this. You really were the glue, and I just think everybody here should acknowledge that. Thank you. Secondly, it was suggested to me earlier that I read this today, and I decided not to do that. But if you could find a piece of paper over there, if anybody would like, I can send you a hard copy and/or email this to you. If you could put a piece of paper out there. You're not obliged to do it, but if you would, I don't have enough copies for everybody. If you could do that, I'll make sure that you get it.
Okay, thank you. I would love that.
All right.
The media gets one anyway.
Pardon?
The media gets one anyway.
Yeah, right.
Well, what were you?
Oh, I live in Amherst. I'm a freelance writer, but I'm a school librarian too,
Good for you. Oh,
part-time.
good for you.
Right here at Clark.
And I invited her because I'm starting a newspaper in town.
That's right.
Oh, good for you.
Yep, called the Amherst Bear, and it won't be until 26, but I thought this could be a great article for President's Day in February for that month, so.
There you go.
Is that good
Yeah.
with you? My name is Sally Brown Bucket, and I lived in this house where it all happened. My husband and I lived in Dover at the time. My husband worked in Portsmouth, I worked in Concord, and we didn't have a phone for 4 years. So if my parents wanted to get a hold of us, they had to call one of us at work. They called my husband, and my husband came home and he said, "Guess who's coming to your parents' house for lunch?" And I facetiously said, "The President of the United States." And he said, "How did you know?" I said, "Oh my God." And of course we didn't have a phone. So we went down to the local drugstore and I called in my Social Security number. And on the day, 50 years ago today, I drove from Concord where I work down here, was stopped at the driveway, was asked for my Social Security number. They gave it to me and then they gave me a lanyard with a press pass on it. So we came in and there was red telephones here and red telephones up in the bathroom, and my brother and sister and I were standing right here. My parents were right behind us, and all of a sudden, 3 limousines just pulled right up in front. My parents went right out, greeted President Ford, who's a lot taller than I ever dreamed he was. And he came in, and all the people of the Republican Women and all the Women's Association from the church were sitting on the stairs so they could get a bird's eye view. So there were 2 by 2 women all the way up the stairs. Well, where did President Ford want to go first? But the bathroom. So they literally parted the seas up the stairs and up he went. And my younger sister writes an anecdotal paper on what the bathroom was like when he saw it, because she and her friends had just been in there. It was a brilliant day. The lunch was out in the breezeway, which is beyond the kitchen. And I remember Mr. Roberts, I remember Mr. Gardner, my aunt and uncle were there. Congressman Jim Cleveland was there,
Right.
who later became President Ford's campaign manager for the state of New Hampshire. He represented the 2nd District. It was an exciting time. We had a lovely chit-chat. I sat right across from President Ford, who told me that his town in Michigan was not unlike Amherst, New Hampshire. In the room over there, they had every single Republican woman that could possibly shake hands was in that room over there. And Margaret Swazinski from Milford, the Republican Club, had made this huge cake that was delivered by taxi on that day. After the event was over, President Ford walked down. He did not get into the car. He walked right up to the town.
He did.
And when he got up to the town, I said, I better grab my camera and go. So I grabbed my camera, went running up there, and they had cordoned it off all in front of the brick school and that little common right there. And they stopped me and I went, "Press," and they let me right there. And so I'm all of a sudden right there. And President Ford's right there. So I go, well, I got my camera, and I click, 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 click. All those pictures are at the Chapel Museum that I took on that day. But it was a very, very exciting day indeed. I was glad to have been here and living it. Well, parents were still living in this house when all that happened. It was a wonderful day.
Thank you. It's right.
It's fun to hear all these different
It is.
sides.
Yeah.
I just lived down the road, so I imagine you walked by my house.
All right.
Well, very good.
Well, I don't know, do we have more stories?
Well, I wouldn't-
Do we have anything else that,
No, I think we have a lot of stories where we gotta be careful of the facts.
well,
We'll call it good.
my wife, Liz, and I really appreciate you coming here today to share these stories with us, and it's been a pleasure getting to know you guys, and, yeah, I'm glad we could do this.
Well, thank you.
So,
Thank you
thank you.
for allowing us to rearrange your furniture.
All right.
That was fascinating. I really said
I'll send you a thank you. Getting to the point where I'm gonna enjoy that work.
How did you know? Did you have a